A note to listeners, the following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences.
My uncle did say one time that Clarence swam 30 miles. Now, I don't know. So he said this occurred when he was escaping. It was on the run, trying to make it back to the house. Clarence probably had about 5 escapes prior to them even robbing the bank in Alabama. And in fact, him and Alfred both were on the run from a previous escape when they did the robbery. So like you said, every single escape, he learned something about what to do and what not to do. And as like Mike said, things that he learned, skills that he learned when he was in reform school, just life in general taught him, and he didn't know this, was preparing him for what was going to occur at Alcatraz.
He talks about in the letter about the sweat box and how they just really kind of roughed him up to get information. Well, one of the punishments they gave him as a result of that escape is they actually put him on a chain gang. Back then when, you've seen the movies with the chain gang, he was on a chain gang, and I don't know if it was a friend of his or if it was just a friend of convenience, but they ran off. He escaped again from the chain gang, ran away, and eventually they were actually caught on the run.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman. Hi, everyone. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, even if it's one word.
And please subscribe to our website, www.partnersintruecrime. Follow us on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram to check out our weekly promos. We're also now on YouTube at Partners in True Crime. If you subscribe to our website, you'll be getting weekly emails from us and all kinds of promotions and things that we don't advertise on the podcast.
We want to thank our listeners for the amazing response to this new podcast, My Uncle's Escaped Alcatraz. Your comments have been great, and we look forward to hearing more from you. Please feel free to reach out to us at partnersintruecrime.com with any questions that you might have. Also, don't forget to check out our other podcasts, Who Killed Molly Miller and Colt Haynes, and The Serial Killer Whisperer. That's 3 days of Partners in True Crime podcasts, all made for our listeners, you.
Today we continue with Ken and Mike on our journey through the Escape from Alcatraz story. For 60 years, this story has captivated the world. And now we're going to discover how Clarence and John became the greatest escape artists of all time.
With the benefit of Ken being their nephew and Mike being a determined researcher, we will reveal the brothers' origin story and discover how their whole childhood was a dress rehearsal for the greatest escape in history. All right, so we're back with Mike Lynch and Ken Widener for another installment of Escape from Alcatraz and the amazing story of Ken's uncles who were able to, one of the few people who got off the rock and survived and lived to tell about it. And we're going to talk about all that great information and all those theories and stories, and some of it which people think are myth, but Ken and Mike have kind of unearthed a lot of great information to prove that both Clarence and John made it off that rock and made it to South America and had a great rest of their life. So Ken and Mike, thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having us.
Yep, thanks for having us.
So I think we were talking about what we wanted to talk about is dive into John and Clarence's childhood a little bit more. Start from the beginning. I know it came from a huge family, 14 children. I can't even imagine that. Just that mirror. I think of like the Octomom when she had all those 8 kids at once. I mean, I saw the pictures, and it's just amazing how that was kind of commonplace back then, especially for people who own farms because they needed the help. But I don't think people realize how that can affect who you become later in life. So
the poverty level. I mean, I don't think people understand the poverty level that was going on back then. They don't understand that you had 14 kids and parents and maybe other relatives all living in like a two-room house. I mean,
that's I was thinking about that today because we were watching a segment on the news, and this individual was talking about how hard that they had it, not being able to provide for themselves, and just really I looked at my wife and I said, "Can you imagine this person explaining that to my grandfather when he was growing up, that's poor. This individual today doesn't even have a clue or even comes close to what poverty really looked like back in the 1940s and 30s. It was very devastating.
Very different. Yeah. And extraordinary to have all those children in that small confined space. And what can you do? They're just trying to get by. They're just trying to survive.
Just to feed them 3 times a day.
Right. You almost sometimes wanted to ask my grandfather, you didn't have a lot of money, and what in the world possessed you to have 14 children? But I think back then it was pretty common for large families to live together and help each other out. And that was really kind of the driving force that I believe that every one of my aunts and uncles, including my mom, when my mom was growing up, it was just known that she was going to work on the farm. And in fact, after she got married my father, they both worked as laborers on a farm. And I believe all of the children saw that as their future. I don't think any of them ever saw, oh, I can become a doctor one day or a lawyer, or, and I can get out of this lifestyle. And I believe every one of them, knowing that this was their destiny, is pretty much what kind of drove Alfred and John and Clarence to say, I don't want a part of this. I see my mom struggling. I've seen her, crying and taking care of 14 kids, barely able to get by. I'm, going to school and clothes that my mom had to make out of a sackcloth, and taking baths on a porch in a wash tub in front of your other siblings. I just think that's what drove them to say, I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm not going to be a farmer, which is kind of ironic because later in life, they actually become farmers, but at the time they wanted what they saw other kids having in their school, because not every kid in their school was that poor. They were probably at the very bottom, and then they saw things in life, and like any other kid, they wanted more than what they were getting.
Now, reading in the book about their early childhood and their experience in school, it was apparent that both of them, they got teased and they got bullied in school. And was that because they were poor?
Yes. I remember my mom telling me that when they lived in Donaldsonville, well, they actually lived in a little town called Iron City, which was between Donaldsonville, Georgia, and Colquitt. They went to school in Donaldsonville, but even there they got bullied because of how poor they were. Moving to Ruskin, I believe they all thought, okay, we're going to have a fresh start. There are other farmers down here that's just like us. But my mom said they quickly learned that as soon as they got to school, and it wasn't just John and Clarence that got bullied, every single one of them did. And John and Clarence and Alfred are just the ones that said they were not taking it anymore. And so they always wound up in fights, or, they were the ones getting in trouble, but it was because they were being picked on. And eventually that just drove them to the point that they said no more school for me, because they had a better time not going to school than they did going to school.
And they didn't really see a future with school. I mean, if they were just going to be farmers, what do they need school for?
One of the things that we talked about in our previous episode was when they moved from Georgia to Florida, they bought the land. I think Ken said it was 9 acres altogether. They didn't have a house. It was just basically a piece of land the father bought, and he had a little bit of money to buy the land. And they actually lived in tents for quite a while, and there were a lot of trees on the property. So eventually he cuts down the trees and takes the lumber to a sawmill, and that was the materials that he used to actually build the house. He built the house himself with the help of his children and some others. So word probably got out pretty quickly when the family moved down to Ruskin that they had really no home. They were kind of homeless in a way, and they were living in tents. So I'm sure they were easy pickings for the other kids to make fun of because of that. That's how poor they were.
Wow.
In a typical day, I remember my mom telling me this, a typical day in their life would be getting up early. They would eat breakfast. They had chores that they had to do before they went to school. Many times, because of the chores, they would miss the bus and they would have to walk to school, which was about a mile. I used to always joke with her, going uphill both ways in the snow, but they truly did walk to school. And then after they got back from school, every one of them had to go into the family farm field and help either whatever they were growing and picking. And then from there, they went and had what they used to call supper. Sometimes I call dinner. But from there, it was doing homework, taking a bath, going to bed. There were no TV at that time. There was no radio. There was no electricity in the house. And so it was pretty much going to bed, and then you start the whole cycle all over. So their life was, to me, I would look at it as miserable. But my mom has a lot of fond memories of that time.
Yeah, well, it looks like they made their own fun. I mean, they were big swimmers. They loved finding these hidden spots that they used to like go swimming and everything like that. There's a great story, I guess, when they went and claimed this one spot and then they ran it to someone else. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that story?
Sure. So when they first moved to Ruskin, as Mike said, they didn't own the farm that they eventually bought, the 9 acres. That came after they got there. Of course, it's not like today where you can get on the internet and go, oh, I'll buy this piece of land and I've got it when I get there. When they arrived, they actually lived very close to a river that feeds into the Tampa Bay called the Alcatraz River. And that's where they had the tents at. And eventually they purchased the land that they would wind up on. But while they were living at the river, this is where they learned to enjoy and swim. This is where they actually ran into their very first meeting with Fred Breezy and his sister. Fred Breezy, his sister, and mother and father lived not too far from the river, and they too would go down as kids and swim in this river. It was a pretty good sized river. And like I said, if you took it out straight out, it would go straight out into the Tampa Bay. And as kids, after they kind of, had a little turf war with Fred Breezy, which is really kind of funny because that did happen. They became very good friends with Fred, him and his sister. And eventually that's where they enjoyed most of their time, was in the water and swimming.
And Fred Breezy would also play a later role in something else that happened with the brothers as well, too, right? And he spent some time in the reform school.
Yeah, as children in a small town, I'm sure the area to get in mischief wasn't just dedicated to poor people. Fred Breezy and his family were not poor compared to the Anglin brothers. And, John and Clarence, that was just something that drew them into that lifestyle, was because they didn't have anything. Not so much true with Fred. I think Fred was just disillusioned child like today, wanting to, have fun. There wasn't a whole lot at that time in Ruskin, Florida. That was a very small town. I think the largest town would have definitely been Tampa, but that was a pretty good little ways away. And as a kid, you did have access to that. So I can see that, both of them doing things that eventually landed them in trouble. What landed John and Clarence and Alfred was they started skipping school to begin with, which is what landed them into reform school. At some point in time, I believe it was actually written in a newspaper one time that it was after the escape, they talked to one of her teachers, and she commented that John and Clarence and Alfred would much rather be swimming than they would in school. And so a lot of times they just skipped school. There was a river that was very close to the school, and they would walk to school like they were going, but then they would just go down this train tracks down to this train trestle that crossed over the river. And I believe it was called the Little Manatees.
Yeah.
And that's where they would swim until it was time to come home, and they would come home. And eventually the school went to the family and said, hey, you either put them in school or they're going to reform school.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time in those rivers and in Tampa in the past year working with a diver, and those waters are probably more dangerous than the San Francisco Bay. We've seen bull sharks, manatees, stingrays, sharks, gators, fire ants. I mean, you name it, it's there to kill you in Florida for sure. So I think the San Francisco Bay is a little safer compared to those areas if they're swimming.
Well, it's where they got their training, obviously, if they're swimming every day.
If you're swimming in those rivers every day, I don't think you'd be afraid of much.
And where they eventually wound up living, their house, as they got older and the house was completed, it was only a mile down to what's called the Haya Beach, which is a beach that is in Ruskin, Florida, and it's a beach that's, you can see it's in the bay. So all of their swimming that they did, it was either in Bahia Beach or Apollo Beach, which was in between Ruskin and Tampa. And like you said, the Tampa Bay is a lot like the San Francisco Bay. There is one way in and out, which is up under the Skyway Bridge in Tampa. And of course, in the San Francisco, it's the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yep.
And so a lot of those same type currents occur in both areas. And they would many times would swim. And I heard my several uncles talk about how that they would just swim all the way out to where the bridge, back then it was an older bridge, and back. And sometimes they would swim 10, 15 miles. So
I was going to say, it's at least 10, 15. I mean, it's far.
Yes. There was, my uncle did say one time that Clarence swam 30 miles. Now, I don't know. So he said this occurred when he was escaping. He was on the run, trying to make it back to the house. So a total of 30 miles that he swam. So, I mean, people sometimes when they think about the escapees and the Alcatraz piece of it, they think, in fact, I've even heard some people say, well, they drowned because the only swimming experience they had was in these little creeks and streams. But that's not even coming close to being true.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Clarence's first escape. That, how old was he? He was like, he had to be a teenager, a young teenager. What did he do to get into reform school? I know they all ended up in reform school for skipping school, but that first time that he went into reform school, can you tell us that story? Because I think it's pretty funny, and it's kind of it plants the seed to what we would later see when they became adults and they were locked up in Alcatraz.
Yeah, it was like I said, if you're not going to school, as my grandmother would say, idle hands is a devil's workshop. They from there they would eventually, it wasn't just skipping school to go swimming. They learned, oh, if I break it, if I open this car, I could grab this battery and take it down to the local wherever they sold it at. I'm not exactly sure where they sold it at, but they did learn stealing car batteries was an easy way to make a few bucks. And back then, a few bucks was a lot of money. So from there, they would break into small businesses and steal stuff. And at some point in time, they did get caught. And because they were so young, they couldn't put them in a jail or prison. They wound up going to the boys' reform school in Marietta, Florida. Now, at that time, Fred Breezy just happened to have been in trouble. He got caught, him and another boy, after being warned several times by the local judge not to appear before his court anymore. He wound up going to the exact same reform school at the exact same time that John and Clarence went, which is totally amazing. So.
Yeah, Fred Breezy and a friend of his, they stole a motorcycle and were kind of joyriding down the kind of the main town area, and police arrested them. And for the judge, that was like the last straw. It's like, okay, I've given you enough warnings, and so they went to was sent to boys' school.
It became an actual. We didn't realize this until a few years ago when Mike and I were doing the research, that it was actually the same reform school that was later in I believe it was around like 2009, 2007. That they discovered that it was a school that they found a lot of graves on the school. And later they went through and determined that a lot of these young boys were misfits, people, boys that didn't have parents, runaways. And it's sad to say that a lot of them met their end by the misuse and misabuse that occurred from the people who were there to run the facility.
Yeah.
Well, and it's probably very true the reason why Clarence and John and Fred Breezy wanted out of the place.
Well, let's talk about the time when just Clarence was in there with Fred Breezy, and because I love the story, when John and his mother went to go visit him, and tell us that story, because I thought that was just, and the little code that John was giving. So it's like they were already working angles even at that. How old were they then? We're like, what, 12, 13?
They would have been in their, very early teenage years. I know that was one thing that my grandmother tried to do, was go see either one of her children if they were in trouble and in jail or reform school at that time. And very early on, John and Clarence, along with Alfred, all learned how to communicate with each other, either through marks that they made. They would communicate with each other when they eventually had access to a phone. A number of rings meant certain things. They had a way of communicating without actually saying it. Something that was so true about all three of them was that every time they got out, especially Clarence, the one place that their authorities knew that they could find them at was at home. Every single one of them, Clarence probably more than John. Clarence was in more reform schools and state prisons than John was, and he escaped way more than what John did. Alfred was pretty much about the same way. But on this particular occasion, my grandmother and John had gone to see Clarence, and he had quite a bit of time left to serve. And as they were leaving, Clarence kind of made the hint to his mom that he was tired of the place. He was ready to come home, and she was doing her best to convince him to, stay where you're at, do your time, don't make it any worse than what it is. And as they were leaving, he gives his brother that certain type look that indicated that he was working on something. Clarence was always working on an escape, all the time. And so when they got home that evening, got up the next morning, had breakfast with the family like as normal, and all of a sudden in walks Clarence. I remember my mom was there when he walked in, and she said that it was just a typical thing because it wasn't the first time he walked in after escaping, and he pulled up a chair and they had breakfast. I believe he spent most of the day there before eventually the authorities came and picked him up. He was right there at the house and took him back. So
I just love the image, the way you described it in the book, is that, everyone was sitting around the breakfast table, and apparently the mother was a very good cook, so everyone was very happy to be sitting around the breakfast table. And then the door just opened, and he's just standing there dripping wet. And he says that you get set another plate.
Yeah,
so just such a great image.
Yeah, my grandfather was he only went to see them one time when they were in trouble and in prison. That was at the Alabama state trial. The rest of the time, my grandfather, he couldn't just leave. I mean, somebody had to take care of the farm and the rest of the family. He very rarely got involved with them when they were in prison, but he did love his children. I can see my grandfather. You would have to know my grandfather. I used to love to sit on his lap and light his pipe. He was so humorous. He was smart. He was funny. And yes, I could definitely see my grandfather making that statement. Pull up, get another plate, and he pulled up a chair and have a seat.
Yeah.
His son was in trouble, but he knew that was his son, and they were fixing to spend time.
It just reminds. All I can see it just reminds me of like a teenage Cool Hand Luke.
Yeah.
It's just that whole image of him just getting out of, I don't know what the reform school looked like, but, I don't know how, it must have been, I don't know if it was easy to get out or if it was, he had to really kind of devise a plan. I mean, who knows? I don't know what it looked like at the time, how they did. Do you have any idea what that reform school looked like?
Well, I'd just like to jump in with this one story at Mariana. They had a sort of a policy or a philosophy of, we have to toughen up the kids to, try to kind of give them discipline and so forth. So if there was a dispute, if there were problems between kids, which was pretty common because, these are troubled youth, they're there for a reason, they would have them box. They would put them in a ring. And, we have a picture in the book of two students there, or not students, but, people who were there fighting each other to kind of duke it out to resolve their problems. You would never have that in a prison today or a reform school where, they slap on the gloves and say, okay, go for it, and then shake hands when you're done, kind of a thing, like all's resolved here. So, that was one thing. But like Ken said, there was also a lot of abuse there, with the workers who worked there, who were supposed to be protecting the children, trying to give them, a direction, a future, but they were very predatory in a lot of cases. Although one of the, they had different classes and shops that they would try to learn a trade, try to learn a skill. Well, one of them, oddly enough, is how to pick locks. Mm-hmm. They actually taught them how to pick locks at this place because they felt it was, something where you're learning a discipline of trying to how to think strategically and try to solve these problems as a life skill rather than a criminal skill.
That's crazy. I mean, I remember, because one of the things I was reading in the book is the fact that Clarence learned a lot on the inside about how to be a criminal and a thief. And he would always come out more educated on what to do on the next scam or next.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, it seems like his personality was very charismatic and he was mischievous. And maybe because he was so poor, you want to make money, you want to have a better life. And there were no other options. So when you're in reform school and you're learning these things and you come out and you're like, well, hey, I learned how to pick locks. I know how to do this. Let's go this route. It might be easier to figure out than trying to
get a regular
job or not even knowing what a regular job was. I think that's even
they did actually work jobs from time to time, but they tended to be more manual labor jobs, more, like if you worked at a grocery store, you had to move all the stuff and carry the big heavy loads kind of a thing. They obviously not very high paying jobs. And so they're getting paid probably pennies an hour this is back in the 40s, very low wages, and they're working very hard and they're getting nothing for it. So like Ken said, the lure of quick, easy money was very high for them. And so it's like, why are we killing ourselves for this hard work and no pay or little pay when we can just steal stuff and make quick money and just have more fun and do the things that we want to do in this place. So and it's funny because like Ken said, there are 14 kids. And, John, Clarence, and Alfred were very, very close. Very, they were like the Three Musketeers in a way. They just did a lot together and they had this bond. And, of course, they were close with their other brothers and sisters. But for the most part, the others were, they were raised in a Christian home. We talked about this last time. They went to a nearby church. So, they had the Judeo-Christian teachings in their lives. And for the most of the family, they adhered to that. They believed in hard work and perseverance and trying to make a better life for yourself. You didn't go down, the dark road to try to make a good life for yourself. But for some reason, these three in particular didn't adhere to that. It's funny how one teaching you go one way and for somebody else they go a completely different way.
Well, where were they in the age range of the other kids? Were they the older ones?
No. So Alfred was the fifth in the lineup. So he was, one of the earlier children. John was right after him. He was number 6. And Clarence was number 7. Clarence and John were actually, I believe Clarence was born 11 months after John. So that was one of the things that everybody used to joke about my grandmother. Either she was having children or she was in the kitchen cooking. So
so they were like Irish twins
having children. And so they were very close together. I mean, every one of the children were maybe a year, 2 years apart. So they were all very, very, very close in age. So they were pretty much at the very beginning of the family. Now, the brother that was in right before Alfred, now I'm going to call him Uncle Man. His real name was Robert Anglin. He was actually named after my grandfather. For some reason, everybody in the family knew him as Man. I don't know why. I've asked that question, is where did the name Man come from? No one could tell me, but all the kids, for the longest time, I thought that was his name. And so it was Uncle Man. But anyway, he told me once that if it had not been for the fact that he got married, he would have been it wouldn't have been 3 brothers, it would have been 4 brothers.
Mm.
He was pretty much going down that same road. But getting married and straightening his life out a little bit helped him. And it's funny because he has a very important part in this story later on as we get into to more detail of the story.
Okay, cool.
But, like you said earlier, though, about Clarence probably had about 5 escapes prior to them even robbing the bank in Alabama. And in fact, him and Alfred both were on the run from a previous escape when they did the robbery. So like you said, every single escape, he learned something about what to do and what not to do. And as like Mike said, things that he learned, skills that he learned when he was in reform school, just life in general taught him, and he didn't know this, was preparing him for what was going to occur in Alcatraz, which would bring to bear pretty much every bit of their talent to accomplish what they did. Because to be honest with you, that was the toughest prison around at the time.
Yeah. What's
So-
interesting, it reminds me of that Malcolm Gladwell book, the 10,000 hour rule,
Right.
that anybody who does anything for 10,000 hours becomes an expert,
Mhm.
like you're talking about. So it sounds like from an early time in his life, he became that expert just from attempting all these escapes and, and getting out. And he's had time to think about basically a engineer's mind to figure all that stuff out.
Right.
To do all that is just so much. It's so much brain power and ingenuity that you have to, and also just downright balls to be able to pull something like that off, knowing what the consequences are. Now, what for him, every time, like when he first escaped and when he would do these escape reform schools, would they just tack on more time for him? And what was the ramifications?
Well, so every time he escaped, they would tack on a little bit more time. But at some point in time, I guess it was a little different than it is now as far as what they would charge you with. But as an adolescent, they eventually said, okay, we're just going to turn him back over to his mom. My grandmother was always one that tried to fight for them, and hey, we'll straighten him out this time. We'll get him on the right path, and they did. It would start off. He would start going back to church. He would not skip school, but eventually it didn't last long, and then it would turn into something else. But even like when you were talking about the Cool Hand Luke episode, Clarence actually had a very similar story in one of his escapes in Rayford Prison, state prison within Florida. He did an escape from there, and it's funny because we actually had the letter that he wrote prior to doing the escape. He had wrote his mom. They were getting ready to come see him, and he asked them, hey, could you bring my guitar with you? And then he turns right around and writes them back again and says, hey, never mind, don't bring it this time. And so right after that, he did his escape. And as he's running through the woods, he went to cross over the Swanee River, and there was a bloodhound almost caught him. Well, in fact, actually must have caught him, because he wound up killing that dog, swimming across the river. This is the incident where he then went and swam in the Tampa Bay and went all the way into Bradenton, Florida, where he then in turn calls his oldest sister, Verner, Aunt Verner, and convinces her, she's married at that time, has children. In fact, my cousin even told me the story because he was with his mom when they went to get him. He calls them. They're the only members of the family. They had already moved out, had their own home. They actually had a phone. They were the only members that I've ever known to have a phone. And so he calls them, and she and my cousin goes to pick him up at a phone booth, and when he comes running out, he's dressed as a woman. He had grabbed clothes off of a clothesline, and my cousin said he came out and he was wearing a dress that didn't even look like Clarence. And jumped in the back of the car, and they sped off. But and of course, where did he go? He went home. And where did they find him? At home. They took him back, because now we have a letter where he wrote this. They took him back and they put him in what's called a sweat box. And they shot tear gas in there with him, trying to make him confess that he had killed the dog. And in the letter, he said, I never told them that I killed him. So wow. He really, withstood everything that they gave him. That, to me, is a story that you would have seen on Cool Hand Luke.
Yeah.
How old was he when that happened?
I just want to add one more detail to that story, is because he talks about in the letter about the sweat box and how they just really kind of roughed him up to get information. Well, one of the punishments they gave him as a result of that escape is they actually put him on a chain gang. Back then, when, you've seen the movies with the chain gang, he was on a chain gang, and I don't know if it was a friend of his or if it was just a friend of convenience, but they ran off. He escaped again from the chain gang, ran away, and eventually they were actually caught on the run. And somehow they procured a couple of guns while they were there, and they had a little bit of money, and I think they stole a car. Finally caught up with them, and they were arrested. That one did make the newspapers. We have a newspaper article about the arrest, and I think 5 years were added to his time after that second escape at Rayford.
Yeah, if I remember.
Yeah, how old was he during that escape?
Like around 16, 17 at that time.
Okay. So how many arrests and reform schools had he been in as a teenager? I just want people to understand that he's not an adult. He's just a kid
I
still.
would probably say from an early age of around like 8 or 9, he probably has been in about 5 to 6 reform schools, about that many state prisons. He was in numerous state prisons. John, on the other hand, went to the reform schools that everyone that he went to, John wound up going to most of them. And John was actually in a couple of state prisons. But I never could really kind of understand how they got out so early. Most of the time, either they had good behavior, got put on parole, or but they did. They would actually not be gone that long, and unless they were on the run and they were gone for good.
Well, they obviously figured out how to work the system within inside the walls of these reformatories and these prisons.
Yes.
They knew how it worked, and they probably ingratiated themselves to the people that they needed to, the correctional officers and the guards, probably became friends with them, probably became friends with a lot of people on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that culture because they had been doing it. Like I said, the 10,000 hour rule, they've spent so much time and so many hours behind the walls of these reformatories and prisons that they figured out the culture and what you needed to do to get by there and to get out of there.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to go back to the part where he was swimming and the distance that you're saying he swam from Tampa Bay to Bradenton?
Yes, he did.
That is far.
I don't know if anybody's listening right now. All our listeners, you should pull up a map.
Well, we'll put up a map.
I know,
because that is really far. I mean, that could be 30 miles.
And that's not easy water to swim in.
No, it's not.
And it's filled with bull sharks, all like Sydney was saying, all these different critters down there that, that's just amazing. And that fact that he's doing it, he's basically swimming for his life.
Oh, and some of it's at night. So he's actually swimming some of this at night. So it's because when they went to pick him up at the phone booth, my cousin said that I believe he said it was fairly late in the evening whenever they got the phone call. And, he said, "Hey, I need help." And my aunt's husband, actually, my cousin said, was furious. He did not want her going down there to get him. He was fearing what was going to happen legally if they got caught. Sure. And they were very devout Christians at the time, and he did not want to get involved in it. But I remember my cousin saying that my aunt, that's the one time that my aunt, he said, went against her husband and said, "That's my blood, my brother, and I'm going after him." And so my cousin said that's when his father said, "Well, if you're going, you're taking," his name was Junior. We call him Junior, but "You're taking Junior with you." And so he was in the car with my aunt when they actually picked up Clarence. So he told me the story when I was pulling together information.
Throw in too this is some time later at Alcatraz, but Whitey Bulger, who will come into the story later on, when Ken and him were writing letters, one of the things that Whitey wrote about, it was mostly for Frank Morris, who was the third member of the Escape from Alcatraz, because he was more situated in Louisiana, but similar part of the country, that when Frank Morris was in a lot of these prisons and penitentiaries, a lot of times the guards would sort of let prisoners escape and they basically hunt them down, kind of almost like for sport. And he wrote about these in his letters, and I'm sure those kinds of things were happening in other parts of the country where you're out there running for your life trying to get away, and if he had been caught on the way, there was a good chance they would have killed him.
It's their version of the most dangerous game.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was in these state prisons and reform schools for stealing and for what else? What were some of his other crimes?
Typically, they were very petty crimes, either stealing batteries out of cars, or they were breaking into small mom and pop stores. Nothing major. The biggest thing they ever did was robbing the bank in Alabama in 1958. That was over their head. I don't think they realized what they had done, but most of all the other crimes were small, petty crimes. And that might have been why they got out so early. You're not going to throw a guy in, back then, you were not going to throw someone in prison for 10 years because they broke into a store and stole some, something they went and sold because they were poor. So,
well, also because they were teenagers. I mean, they were so young.
Right. So yeah, nothing that I'm aware of. Now, if they did do a crime like armed robbery or something, I'm not aware of it. The only crime that I know that they did that I would consider to be major was the bank robbery.
Yeah, it sounded like it was a little bit of like a Raising Arizona bank robbery for them too.
Yeah, they weren't violent. They weren't harsh people. They didn't abuse people. They didn't, threaten people or beat up people. They didn't. That's not what they were about. They just wanted money for living nice. That's all it really was for them. And if they had to steal from a family or from a business, I think they stole some payroll at a company. It was a couple $1,000s, I think, which for back then was a whole lot of money. But they were small timers. They were local thieves. That's really what they were.
The biggest thing they did was escape these places.
Yeah, I would say of all the crimes that they did prior to the bank robbery, the biggest crime was the escape itself.
Yeah, because they don't like, the system doesn't like when people escape. So I'm sure there was a black eye on all those prisons and the correctional, so I'm sure they don't like that. So I'm sure that kind of escalated it. Regardless if they were not doing violent crimes, they were pissing off the people in power.
Well, and one other story just to throw in there for Alfred. He was at another prison at the time. He had written a letter telling his brothers he was going to get out and when he was going to get out, and so they met him at the prison. It was at Rayford, I believe.
I believe it was Rayford.
And he gets out, jumps into the car, and they skedaddle, back to the house. But Alfred had learned from Clarence of the dangers of staying at the house, because sooner or later the authorities are going to come looking. So he actually, nearby where they lived, there was a place called the Pits. Where they lived was just like barely above sea level. It's like 2 feet above sea level. And there's a lot of limestone. There's a lot of, or not limestone, but there's like, all the shells and the fish and everything that just have just sort of built up that area over the centuries. So when I think it was the Portuguese it was the Spanish. The Spanish came to Florida, was part of their empire for a time. Well, they realized it was good for, raw materials for different kinds of things. So they were digging out these areas, and so that's what the pits were. They were basically dig these big holes and take the material and use it for other purposes. And over the centuries, there's all these holes, deep holes around the area. Well, eventually they fill up with water because of all the rain. And sooner or later, people start stocking these little pools of water with fish. And so it becomes sort of a fishing area, sort of unofficially speaking. Well, Alfred realized he didn't want to go back, and he couldn't stay home, so he lived in the pits for 5 years. The family had set up a tent and camping stove and just sort of try to make him as comfortable as possible. For 5 years while he's on the run, that's where he lived to evade the authorities.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and I believe that the last escape that Clarence did, he wound up staying with him at this, what they call the Pits. It was a very popular place that members of the family would go down and on the weekends and fish. And I don't remember it at the time because I wasn't even born then. But my older sister said that she remembers going to the Pits with my mom and dad and other family members. And there was a guy down there. Everybody was told to call him Uncle Charlie, but it was actually Alfred. They didn't want it, They didn't call him by his real name. Everybody knew who he was. They just didn't reference him by his real name.
Yeah,
so it was, it was a lot of, that was probably the most, what you would say would be the most crime that they would have been charged with was the escape piece of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's fascinating that as young children, they already figured out how to escape from prison.
Yeah. Well, they had, we'll talk about this later in other chapters, but they learned even before getting into trouble how to escape out of the house without getting caught. My grandfather was a loving man, but he was very strict. He would not hesitate to put the belt to anybody, including his grandkids if they needed it. But he was the kind of man that, when he told you to do something, you did it. And so my mom said that they were all told, when you go to bed, you stay in bed. Well, John and Clarence figured out how to sneak out of the house at a young age, and they learned how to set up a believe it or not, dummy heads in the beds that they would use to fool my grandfather in thinking that they were still in bed and they were out gallivanting. So
that is amazing. That the fact that started when they were kids, just so they could sneak out of the house and do what they wanted to do.
Oh, they were all the time getting in trouble with my grandfather.
It's total. It's like, it's, all I can think about is Ferris Bueller right now. That movie. He did the same thing.
I remember this one story. I'm gonna go tell a story that I don't think is it might be in the book. I remember my mom telling that a neighbor came over to my grandfather and accused Clarence of killing one of his little pigs, chasing him and killing it. Well, my grandfather didn't. This is the kind of man he was. He didn't even ask Clarence, did he do it or whatever. He just quickly, pulled his belt out and spanked him very severely for it. And then Clarence looked at him and said, okay, you just spanked me for something I didn't do. Now I'm going to do it.
Wow.
So, that was, you could see the side of my grandfather, but you could also see the side of Clarence, that he was one that if you were going to accuse him of something, you better accuse him of something that he did. And so, but all of the neighbors always knew how John and Clarence and Alfred worked. They always looked at them as the kind of kids that they didn't want their kids around because they were always getting in trouble. So they were either in trouble with my grandfather, in trouble with neighbors, or in trouble with the law.
And it seemed like they were moving targets, so they were constantly moving.
Yes.
That's crazy.
And swimming.
Swimming. They did love swimming.
Oh, and actually one other thing, you're talking about the 10,000 hours. One of the things I just want to throw out was when they were young teens, 10, 11, 12, with the river, there was a lot of boating, a lot of recreational boating in the area, because as Ken said, it fed into Tampa Bay, and the rivers are big, they're not little creeks. And so the boats would go back and forth. Well, they used to hang out on the beach and, had a rope swing, jump in the water kind of thing, or just swim. Well, if a boat would stop, sometimes if they could do it, they would tie ropes to the back of the boats unbeknownst to the driver. And then they would get towed into the middle of the river. And they did this many times. So they learned expertise of how to be towed by a powerboat, down the river, which would of course, come into play years later at Alcatraz, another skill that they had learned how to do.
Well, Tampa Bay, I didn't have a clue that they were able to swim from Tampa Bay to Bradenton. That just changes my whole perception of this completely.
That's
because if they could swim that, I've been in both San Francisco Bay and Tampa Bay many times, they could easily swim San Francisco Bay.
You said he did a lot of it at night.
Oh yeah, the escape that he did at that time was his travel time was at night, because it was pretty late at night when he wound up calling my aunt to come get him.
How long did it take him to swim that distance?
That I don't know. My cousin didn't say how long he had been on the run when he called. I do know it was at night. So and he was. One of the reasons why he grabbed clothes off of the clothesline was because he was soaking wet, and also he was in a prison uniform, and he was trying to not stand out to anyone that happened to come by. But to me, that's just another story, that's another tale that backs up the story we've heard years later after the escape, that they showed up at my grandmother's funeral dressed as women. Sometimes, I was there at my grandmother's funeral. I don't remember seeing, although I was very small, there could have been someone there that was dressed as a woman that was a man. But it does show that they did do that in the past. And in fact, and one day I hope to see this photo, but one of the photos that was in the pouch that they discovered in the San Francisco Bay is, and this is exactly what it says in the FBI files. It said it's a woman standing beside a car, and then on the back of it, it says, "This is Alfred." So clearly Alfred knew how to do this dressing up as a woman, and that must have been something that they had done in the past. Whether or not it was a way of breaking into something or as disguise, but if Clarence and Alfred had done that in the past, I'm sure John probably at some point in time did that.
Wow. Prison escapees doing it in drag. That's kind of...
Yeah, that's one way to look at it today.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. I think I think you guys covered these guys really well. like I said, I'm visualizing this. It's so rich with character and stories and just like I said, it just reminds me of every prison story that you hear, like, Cool Hand Luke. It reminds me of him so much because he was just so likable and he wasn't like a threatening inmate. And it seems like all three of those guys.
They had charisma. They were mischievous, but they had charisma. They were able to talk people into things, and people probably genuinely liked them, even though they were stealing stuff and getting in trouble all the time. But it sounds to me that they had a lot of charisma that drew people in to kind of help them along the way. That was
some of the comments that Whitey Bulger wrote in his letters to me, was how nice of guys they were. He kept calling them very good guys. And he even commented in one of his letters that the very first time he ever saw John coming into the yard in Alcatraz, he said it reminded him of Steve McQueen.
There you go.
So that Steve McQueen, the Cool Hand Luke, that was really them. That was who they were. They were very low key. They kept to themselves. They didn't start trouble. And that was one of the things I think they learned, that if you're going to do an escape, you don't need to stand out to the guards. You need to be low key. You need to be almost to where you're invisible to them. And no one really thinks that you're capable of doing what you're doing.
So those are like my two favorite movies, Cool Hand Luke and The Great Escape. So it's just and you look at both of those characters in that, and they have that same kind of charisma and like, I don't give a fuck attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm going to do it anyway. And in spite, a lot of times it's spiteful. Like you said, was it Clarence? You said, he goes, well, yeah, I didn't, you hit me with a strap for killing that pig. He goes, I didn't do it, but now I'm gonna.
But now I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
Well, and as we get into other chapters, we'll be able to show too that there was a reason why they tried to get out of Alcatraz, and they started it. But there are so many other stories and tales and pieces that are in the upcoming chapters that we'll be able to really dive in and talk about.
Fantastic. Well, this has been awesome, guys.
Thank you so much.
It's so entertaining. Listen to these stories and can't wait to dive deep and get into all the nitty gritty other stuff that you're going to reveal to us. So thank you so much.
Please visit our website where you can subscribe to the podcast, find show notes, and check out extra content from all of our podcasts. All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.